Bruchim Abayim to the brand new series, which will be devoted to the commentary of the Netziv to the Chumash Ha'amek Dava. In any case, the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, whose lifetime spanned most of the 19th century, in addition to his monumental commentaries on the Sheiltis, the Sifri, the Mechilta, his responsa Shalosh Tshuvos Meshiv Davar. There are commentaries on Nevim Ksuvim. He has a major commentary on the Shas, Belumei Sadeh. But in addition to all these major commentaries on the for the most part, the rabbinical canon. In addition to this, he wrote a very, very famous commentary on the Chumash, on the Chamishi Chumshet Torah, which he entitled Ha'amek Dava. Rabbi Herzog informs me it should be really Ha'amek Daber, but anyway, the Nikud in the original edition is Dava. In any case, what we're going to do is we're going to be exploring the derech, the style, and the Netziv's conception of what Chumash is. And of course that conception of what Chumash is not only the Chumash in and of itself, but also the relationship of the Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral law, learning that of Chazal to the Chumash. As with most great thinkers, the Netziv in fact hides as much as he reveals, and the purpose of the series of Shiurim will be to reveal that which, in my opinion, he has heretofore hidden to the majority of people. I'm going to begin, and we're going to devote several Shiurim, I hope we get through it, to a Hagdama, which the Netziv writes to the Ha'amek Dava, which he entitles Kidmas Ha'emek. Kidmas Ha'emek. In addition to Hagdamas, which he writes to each of the Chamisha Chumshet Torah, there's a famous Hagdama to Bereshis, a Psicha, as he calls it, a Psicha to Bereshis. There are Psichas to the other Chumshet Torah. Nonetheless, there's a general Hagdama, Kidmas Ha'emek, in which the Netziv, in fact, is going to state and present what one would call his how he's going to proceed to write a perush, a commentary on the Chumash. And in my opinion, understanding this Hagdama, understanding this introduction, is fundamental to understanding the Netziv's, number one, Netziv's whole conception of what the text of the Chumash is, and number two, how he's going to carry this out in his perush afterwards. Okay, now the Hagdama is divided into several sections. There's a total of, I believe, 11 sections in the Hagdama. And we're going to actually try to understand, we're not going to try to look at all of them, but we're going to understand as much as possible several of them in order to garner an understanding, once again, of the Netziv's concept of the text of the Chumash. Okay. Netziv, the Hagdama is entitled Kidmas Ha'emek, and the title continues to read Mibal HaMachaber Ha'amek Dava, from the author of Ha'amek Dava, Laharais, to show, and I assume that Netziv wrote this because the language is too loaded to have been written by none other than the Netziv. Laharais, to demonstrate, Ki Mikloi Kodesh yesh behem toich ubal. Mikloi Kodesh have toich ubal. Now, toich ubal are actually terms which indicate inside and outside. One might think that in fact toich and bal just mean different levels of meaning, but the Netziv actually definitely is using the Aramaic expression Teichu Ba, which appears several times in Shas. The Talmud Chacham, Chazal speak about in Chav Ches and Brachas and Beis and Yuma has both a Teichai and a Barai, an inside and an outside. So the Netziv says Laharais, I'm going to come to demonstrate Ki Mikloi Kodesh, that Scripture Yesh Behem have Teichu Ba, an inside and an outside, an exterior and an interior. And these are understood to one who studies them, who contemplates them, who studies them, in accordance with the apprehension of the person who's studying them. In other words, basically, this inside and outside will be contingent upon the ability of the commentator, the ability of the one who studies Scripture. Okay, now, that doesn't really tell us much, but actually as we go on, we're going to actually explain a little bit more what is actually meant by this title. Now, Aleph, this is the first section of the Kidmas HaEmek. So, the Netziv begins by saying, Ba'es asa kadosh baruch hu me'ruv v'voish kodesh, u'v'yodei eish das liYisrael. Now, the Netziv is actually paraphrasing here a pasuk in the Chumash. It's a pasuk at the very end of the Chumash in Zos HaBracha, where it says, "Hayfir mihaporen v'asim v'voish kodesh mino eish das lamoy." Now, it's very interesting that the Netziv, the first sentence of the Netziv, actually quotes this pasuk, because this is actually the pasuk which is quoted at the very beginning of another famous introduction of the Netziv, and that is to his extensive commentary, his classic, maybe his Magnus Opum, his commentary to the She'iltis, which actually he calls Ha'amek Sha'ala, and there the Netziv, based upon this pasuk, understands that the Torah, in a certain sense, I guess I'm going to have to use this term, evolves, right? In accordance with a dialectic between what he terms Eish and Das. Das, according to Netziv, represents the aspect of Torah which stems from Ruach HaKodesh, Nevuah, perhaps Minhag, tradition, and Eish, Netziv refers to the aspect of Torah which stems from Pilpul, from analytic thinking, from analysis, etc. So the Netziv, in his lengthy introduction to the Ha'amek Sha'ala, in fact, actually goes through literally an entire history of the Torah Sh'Bi'al Peh, including Ga'indim and Vishonim, and there he actually speaks about this interplay and dialectic which shape the progression of Torah throughout the generations, the dialectic involving the two variables of what one would call Eish and Das. Evidently, it's clear that the Netziv understands that there, in addition to the comparison, parallelism in names, Ha'amek Dava and Ha'amek Sha'ala, to this, the Netziv obviously is trying to explain to us, at least those who understand very well, that there are going to be important parallels between this Hagdama and the Hagdama to Ha'amek Sha'ala, which means that Ha'amek Sha'ala is going to speak about notions of progress and evolution. Certainly, the Netziv is going to speak about this in this Hagdama to which he is, and Yetz Hashem, as we'll see. So it says in the Netziv, Higdil Koya Kol Echad Me'a'imdil L'fnei Ahau. Right? The Netziv, so Kodesh Baruch Hu set boundaries, or actually set boundaries to the powers, the intellectual powers of those who stood in front of Har Sinai. Gamba midosim sofiv v'ha. In other words, says the Netziv that in fact actually, just as Klal Yisrael, as they stood in front of Har Sinai, were bounded in the sense that they were not allowed to get too close to Har Sinai, the Netziv understands that actually the Jewish people themselves, right, actually were bounded among themselves, meaning that they were bounded. There was a hierarchy. In other words, there were front row seats and there were back seats, right? So in other words, the Netziv is bedayik from the pasuk says that the process of drawing boundaries referred to the nation. It says the Netziv Balas Ha'am, v'lo ksiv Balas Ha'am. Okay, so in other words, what does this mean? This means that not everybody stood at the same place, right? In relation to Har Sinai. And the purpose of this, as the Netziv says, is in other words, not every person was able to perceive the same revelation. The Shefa Kedusha was different for different people in accordance with where they stood around Har Sinai. There were, I guess, concentric circles around Har Sinai, and depending upon whether they stood in an inner circle or an outer circle, that determined the Shefa Kedusha, the divine revelation that you apprehended. Okay, and that's what it says. Lo nishtava shefa nevuah l'chol ha'oimdim. Not every person had the same prophetic apprehension. Kefi hamidosam kach haysal hagosam kach haysal v'nosam b'dvar Hashem. Okay. Now, so in other words, the Netziv establishes that, which means which a person can very, very easily interpret as meaning simply is that everybody understands, the Chumash differently. Which you'll say to me, well, what's novel in this? What's the big chiddush? I mean, we all know that everybody understands the Chumash differently. That's what the Netziv speaks about in section 1, in Aleph. In Chelik Beis, right, the Netziv goes on and shows, once again, the Bekias in Teshuvah is, of course, phenomenal, right? One could say perhaps the Netziv was the last person to have known Kol HaTorah Kula in its very true sense, to have understood Kol HaTorah too in its very true sense. But the Netziv also speaks about the need that a person has to reflect upon the Chumash. In other words, not enough just to read the Chumash, but a person has to be mizbained. In other words, a person has to read it and reflect and study it to the best of his ability. That's what the Netziv establishes in Beis. In other words, not like, even though, we know that, Chumash is learned by everybody, even by Tinokah Shebeis Rabban. Magen Avraham says in Shulchan Aruch that if a person learns Psukim even without understanding them, he gets schar, as opposed to Teresh Shpi Al Peh. But nonetheless, the Netziv here advances the idea, based upon Chazal, that actually there's a mitzvah of a person to try to understand the Chumash to the best of his ability. And that's what the Netziv says towards the end of Beis. As Harazu, so it says that even refers to the Torah is coming to tell us, Al Havin b'mikra Al Kol Koitz Shalol Achshev Chas V'Shem Shenafel b'mikra L'Chtov Kach. In other words, the person shouldn't think there's anything in the Torah is extraneous or random, but rather a person has to understand every detailed aspect of the Torah. The expression that says Kol Koitz V'Koitz, which means every part of every word, letter, has to be understood. Okay. This is all very nice, and the person can read the Netziv and say, okay, fine. Right? He's weaving together Chazals and Psukim, but once again, what's novel here? What's the chiddush here? Right? Although the chiddush is that Netziv is saying that there's actually a mitzvah for the Torah to understand the Chumash deeply, but in addition to that, what's novel? Like I said before, when the Netziv speaks about different people standing at different distances from Har Sinai, the Hagbolas Ha'am, which took place at Matan Torah, so one would think that what the Netziv is coming is to justify what you would call an individualized personal interpretation of the Chumash. In other words, every person is supposed to interpret the Chumash in accordance with his ability, and every person has a unique connection with understanding the Chumash based upon his abilities and Siyata Dishmaya. That's how you would understand the Netziv. However, if you go on and read further in the Kidmas HaEmek, which, like most introductions, I expect that most people don't read on in introductions. It's clear from the Rambam that people only begin the first part of the introduction and never end up reading the rest of the introduction and say, oh, you're not telling me anything new, so therefore why should I continue? But the fact is that the Netziv later on, and we're going to make this very, very clear in later Shu'urim, compares the commentary, the activity of commentary, to the scientific enterprise. In fact, the Netziv is going to speak about what he calls the Teva HaTorah, the nature of the Torah, and the Netziv is actually going to make several important parallels between scientific research, the scientific enterprise, and commenting on the Torah. And the Netziv is going to speak about rules, he speaks about, he's going to speak about choik, law, just as in science there's natural law, there's equation, so in the Torah you have the Gimel Midrash, HaTorah Nidreshet Bahem, etc., etc. Clearly, if we're going to compare the study and the understanding of the Torah with the scientific enterprise, we can't speak about individualized and subjective interpretation. Science, unless you're a extreme postmodernist, so the scientific enterprise is nothing, that resembles what you would call an individualized, personal and subjective discovery of subjective truth. What I understand that Netziv is saying, and this is we're going to actually read on and see how this is going to bear out the rest of the Hagdama, is that Netziv, I think, is coming to hint that, and it's interesting, that Netziv doesn't speak about different levels of multiple interpretations. Netziv speaks about an inside and an outside, which in modern lexicon means there's an esoteric and exoteric aspect of the Chumash. In other words, there's an exoteric aspect of the Chumash which is available, right, to most people, which is apprehended by most people. Most people read the Chumash and, they get what's called the exoteric pshat, right? The exoteric understanding. However, there's also an esoteric aspect of the Chumash. Now, the esoteric aspect of the Chumash, what I'm speaking about, is not speaking about Kabbalah, or as the Netziv actually speaks about later on, this is what's called the Segula to the Torah. But in fact, actually, there's an esoteric aspect to what the Netziv is going to call the pshat of the Chumash. In other words, the pshat, the intended meaning of the Chumash, has an esoteric dimension, which is in fact not readily accessible to most people who read the Chumash. Only specific individuals, I guess those who stood, or their Sharash Neshama stood, had box seats at Har Sinai, right? This esoteric pshat of the Chumash is accessible only to very, very few people who have the God-giving ability, and of course the Siyata Dishmaya and Shefa Kedusha, to probe it and understand it properly. So in other words, what Netziv is saying here is that while most people can understand the Chumash, right, in accordance with their own level of understanding, right, nonetheless, there is an esoteric level of pshat which is accessible only to a handful of a very select group of people. That's what the Netziv is saying. Now, what's interesting is that what the Netziv, of course, compares this esotericism of the Chumash to actually a type of esotericism in the physical creation. The Netziv goes on and speaks about that, for example, most people look at the world and they look at, the world, the physical world around them, and most things, for people have certain explanations, but there are certain things which appear in nature that most people feel they can understand. In other words, the nature acts in certain ways which are nistar, which are hidden, right? It's only at a later point that people actually discover that these hidden things can actually be explained scientifically, because there's an advance of science, and people formulate what's called chukos hateva, laws of nature, which, with the progress of history, encompass more and more phenomena, right? So, just witness scientific advances, right, on all levels. So, too, the Netziv says, is with the teva HaTorah. There's a nature of the Torah, and there are chukos HaTorah. There are laws of the Torah, and the Netziv speaks about the Yud Gimel Midas, HaTorah Nidreshet Bahem. He first begins with the Midas of Hillel, and goes on to that of Rabbi Yishmael, and then goes on to Rabbi Yitzhak Galili. In other words, the Netziv understands that actually the fundamental understanding of the Torah Shebechsav is really understanding the rules, the equations, right, in a similar manner in which the fundamental understanding of nature has to do with understanding the equations of science. So what's interesting is that for the Netziv, the primary a priori fundamental truth of the Torah, just as it is for science, are these rules we call hermeneutical rules, right? Which in fact are able to be advanced by Chachmei Yisrael, and in so doing understand more and more aspects of the Torah which heretofore were not understood. Now, what I want to actually, when I'm going to speak in the Hagdama, it's not enough just to interpret the Hagdama. We have to bring examples from the Ha'amadava. But actually what I want to do is I want to show that this notion of the a prioriness of the rule, right, is actually how the Netziv understands the very nature of creation, and he expresses this in his Perush to the first pasuk of the Chumash. The first pasuk of the Chumash speaks about Bereishit bo Elokim eis hashamayim v'es ha'aretz, and there the Netziv understands, first of all, the Netziv understands that in fact the uses of the word Elokim, right, which actually denotes, as Rashi and all the Rafot explain, denotes din, says the Netziv, din doesn't necessarily mean that it's always translated strict justice, but actually the Netziv understands din means law, scientific law, chok, chukah shamayim va'aretz. In other words, and in fact, actually, this is a beautiful interpretation of the famous Chazal, once again, which is brought by Rashi, because Baruch Hu thought to create the world with din, which means that the fundamental a priori creation rests upon what's called scientific law. And Shemayim va'aretz, the Netziv understands, are not the objects, heavens and earth, but Shemayim va'aretz actually mean a mashpia and a makabel, which in the concept of the Netziv is speaking about a cause and effect. So in other words, the Netziv understands that the fundamental truth which the Torah is communicating to me, it speaks about that the fundamental truth of creation is natural law, scientific law. So just as with natural creation it's scientific law, so too as it is with metaphysical creation. The Torah Kedosha is the fundamental truth of Kedosha is metaphysical divine laws, which according to the Netziv can be discovered by man through his assiduous study of the Torah. So the fact is that the main thrust of this Hagdama is what I would call the secret agenda of the Netziv is to advance the idea that there's an esoteric fundamental dimension to the Torah Shebechsav, which is accessible to those few and select who apply themselves assiduously to its study, right? And this fundamental esoteric dimension is the discovery, the intellectual discovery of the fundamental laws, the teva of the Torah, which underline the Torah Shebechsav as they do underline the physical creation. Now, why are we speaking about something which is esoteric? Why, in other words, why make this esoteric? So I want to make the following claim. I think this is going to bear out in the next section too of the Netziv. Most people understand that the Torah is something fixed in and of itself. A man comes to interpret the Torah. In other words, if I asked you, what is the Torah? The Torah Shebechsav. You'll say the Torah Shebechsav is a text. A man comes to understand the meaning of the text. The meaning is there within the text. And in fact, actually, in other words, it's right there in the text, and the meaning is there to be plucked out by the person who understands the lashon, the language of the Torah, the tiktuk, perhaps Chazal, etc., etc. I think what the Netziv here is coming to advance is that, in fact, there is no fixed text of the Torah. There's merely interpretation. In other words, if in fact the fundamental yesod of the Torah is the discovery of those laws which underline the Torah. So what we're saying is that, in fact, even more fundamental than the actual text of the Torah is, in fact, actually the methodology of interpretation, right? Which means, and as the Netziv is going to explain later on, this is because the Torah is constantly evolving, that in fact man's understanding of the Torah is constantly evolving. The Netziv is going to speak about this, by the way, in Ma'aseh Bereishis too. Get ready for that. But in other words, the point of the Netziv is that the notion of a fixed text understanding, let's put it, a fixed understanding of the Torah is a misnomer. But it's a good misnomer, which is good for most people whose understandings of things are rather limited. For the person who truly understands what the Torah is, there is no fixed understanding of the Torah, just as there's no fixed understanding of science. Right? It advances a rather Herman-Cohnian version of Neo-Kantianism, in which the Kantian transcendental is merely a methodology which refers to the infinite progress and the infinite progress and of the scientific enterprise. So too, there's a process of interpretation, a process of discovery of deeper and deeper laws, which is explained more and more. And this process, I won't say it's infinite, but nonetheless, it's a process which continues, and continues persistently. And because of this, there is no fixed interpretation or understanding of the Torah. The Torah's understanding is always in flux, which means that what the Netziv is saying is that really there is only what we would call in layman's language Torah shebe'al peh. The Torah shebe'ksav is ultimately the vehicle for the activity of what Torah shebe'al peh is. This is something which most people could not even conceive or understand, and certainly that's not what they have in mind when they learn the Chumash. And if you tell them something, they would think you're absolutely crazy. Just like the Rambam speaks about the people of Mitzrayim, if you would explain monotheism to them. But nonetheless, this is what the Netziv's hidden agenda. He wants to show that this Toich of the Torah is really likened to a intellectual enterprise which persistently and in a perpetual way seeks out greater and more encompassing laws which underline the interpretive and hermeneutical essence of the Torah itself. Yeah.
This may be a linguistic question, and it may be to be answered later, but it seems to me there's a difference between biological evolution and...
We're not speaking about
no,
that.
and the word evolution in terms of biological evolution, and the word evolution in terms of scientific discovery.
No. We're gonna make that. This is gonna be discussed later on. The Netziv is actually, we're going to speak about this not in this lecture, but I think in another 2-3 lectures. The Netziv is going to actually speak about how HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, as we parallels with which HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world in which man apprehends God. We're going to speak about that.
My question is, in evolutionary biology, every later development is necessarily based on what came before. In scientific development, it's transformed. Things are rejected and things are incorporated. There's no modern science is not built on Aristotle.
Right.
Is there a sense in the Netziv that we're using more modern word necessarily based, or is my current interpretation necessarily based on Achronim Rishonim?
We're going to speak. That's going to be the next year. But let me make it clear. The Netziv understands that actually the basis, the direction, and the structure of this hermeneutical process is to be guided by Chazal. In other words, we're going to explain about this a bit next year. The Zitzenleben of the Chumash is none other than that of Chazal. And Tzivik states this very, very explicitly in what we're going to speak about. In the notion of Shiva. But in other words, be that as it may, yeah.
No, so he's not necessarily speaking about modern interpretations.
No, chas v'shalom. No, chas v'shalom. Chas v'shalom. The Netziv. I can't say chas v'shalom enough. Actually, as we're going to see the next Shir Mitzvah Hashem, the Netziv is actually going to establish the primacy and a prioriness of Chazal too. In fact, according to Netziv, the litmus test of truth in any interpretation is if a person is mechaven to either a halacha or musa of Chazal. But the relationship of Chazal to the Chumash is going to actually be quite novel. But in so doing, we're going to actually explain this. The Netziv is actually going to present to us a very deeper understanding of Chazal, which will only strengthen, Mitzvah Hashem, our amunah of faith in Chazal themselves. But that Mitzvah Hashem will be for the next year. In any case, this is the hidden agenda of the Netziv, and Mitzvah Hashem, I think we will. We'll stop over here. This is food for thought. The Netziv understanding the Chumash, the text of the Chumash as a process, very much in the way Gelman said that the Feynman integral might be more fundamental than the quantum mechanics itself. But we'll leave that for the physics buffs. In any case, from an undisclosed location in Yerushalayim, Iraq Kodesh, be well.